XXV News has learned from its sources that an LAPD operation in Mid-City has gone tragically wrong. A time attack on an active crime scene stunned the LAPD today. It has learned that a car theft ring operating with seeming impunity in the Florida Keys was panic and terror. That's an eyewitness description of one small desert town as police and suspects exchanged gunfire around a mid-city laundromat with a decidedly suspicious name. The LAPD attempts to push a brazen Eastside criminal gang from its so-called territory. Standoff outside the Federal Deposit Bank in downtown Los Angeles threatens to erupt in violence. Stay with Sky 5 News.
Legend has it that Battlefield Hardline began as a casual conversation over drinks between DICE Stockholm's general manager and Visceral Games vice president. Discussing the ongoing work of both studios, Battlefield 3 for DICE and Dead Space for Visceral, the pair decided to revive an old, pre-Battlefield 1942 concept of a cops and robbers style shooter. Whether the story is true or not, it was decided that Visceral Studios would take the reins of the project, with DICE in a supporting role. But before committing the entire studio, they would acclimate themselves to the world of Battlefield by being the primary creators of Battlefield 3's endgame DLC. This expansion would be characterized by large open map designs and fast vehicular combat, the latter of which would be a central theme of their new game. Development of Hardline was rumored to have officially begun in early 2012, before the release of even Battlefield 4. This also gave the studio a lot of information on what went into the makings of a full Battlefield game, and with the added bonus of major lessons and community feedback from the community test environments. Exceptional gunplay, game modes, and vehicle design would be critical to get right. Battlefield Hardline was intended to be announced during E3 2014, but a string of information, art concepts, and even a trailer leaked early. Studio Vice President Steve Papoutsis officially revealed the game on an EA blog post on May 27, 2014 as a result. The game's theme was a drastic departure from the franchise norm. Grand international battles were set aside for smaller local conflicts. War-torn set pieces were replaced by city blocks and urban business locales. Notably, the entire game, from single-player to all multiplayer levels, was set within the United States for the first time ever. The factions available, naturally, were scaled down as well. The teams for every battle pit law enforcement officers against a criminal enterprise, and a well-funded one at that given their equipment. The game took a more humorous approach to character voice lines, a decision which some players took issue with. Swearing is common and the dialogue cheesy. It nevertheless greatly contributed to the game's unique style and nostalgia, with lines still remembered and quoted by the gaming community. Despite a long development cycle, Battlefield Hardline would be delayed from its intended launch date of October 21, 2014 into the following year, officially launching on March 17, 2015 in North America and March 19th for everywhere else. Immediate reactions were mixed. Core Battlefield players were both confused and underwhelmed by the game's cops and criminals theme, and by the domestic local conflicts rather than the traditional all-out international war setting, which would also result in a lack of major vehicles like tanks and attack helicopters, as well as the immersion of major military combat. Many players felt the lack of a serious tone indicated a disconnect from the main franchise. Both of these factors are usually summed up by players as Hardline not feeling like Battlefield, regardless of gameplay similarities, and it was the primary reason for non-interest. Other factors contributed heavily as well. There was the game's overlap with ongoing support for Battlefield 4, the current flagship Battlefield title, now going strong after years of updates and content. The release date of Hardline was also lackluster. Weapon numbers were fairly low, vehicles were limited, and game stability was rough. Bugs were frequently encountered. While many of the technical issues and content criticisms were quickly addressed, the impression of a game which did not feel like it belonged in the franchise could not be shaken from the collective consensus. Unlike its predecessor, Battlefield 4, Hardline decided to go with the only Battlelog method of launching the game, at least on PC. Just like Battlefield 3, this was the only method by which players could load single-player or multiplayer. Even though Battlefield 4 did receive an in-game launch menu in time and satisfy that need for players who preferred it, Hardline would never receive this. Fans were excited to once again have the full suite of statistics, assignments, and community features at their disposal with Battlelog. A progression system up to rank 150 was present, visualized by icons of French playing cards. Over 250 assignments were available to each player, with rewards coming in the form of emblems, weapons, and camos. Coins and bounties replaced ribbons and medals found in Battlefield 3 and 4, respectively. Minor changes included new patches which replaced dog tags, and player emblems, which could now be sprayed on walls in-game. Battle packs returned from Battlefield 4 unlocked through playtime or purchase. Platoons, leaderboards, and other community tools were also present. However, Hardline went an extra mile by adding multiple new features on top of vast existing ones found previously. First and foremost was the cash system that permeated almost every aspect of the game. Shown on a player's Battlelog profile, cash was earned through positive gameplay actions and more significantly through objective and team-based actions. Unlike all games prior, cash could be used to unlock weapon attachments, gadgets, camos, vehicle specializations, and most of all, guns, which could be purchased at any order without the need for completing assignments or requirements. That being said, some weapons were still assignment-based and locked until the challenge was completed. While there was no limit to the amount of cash players could accumulate, one of the early criticisms of the game was the difficulty new players had in growing their personal cash, and only being able to unlock items at a slow pace. There was also definitely a learning curve for the system, and players needed to be careful with what they bought with limited funds. For frequent players, this wasn't too much of a problem, as in-game scores equated to a cash value reward and quickly added up. Playing for objectives was heavily incentivized given the bonuses. Overall, the system was unique and extremely beneficial to balance long-term rewards. To help alleviate cash-strapped players, a voucher system was added to Battle Pack rewards. These could be used to instantly unlock a corresponding camo or weapon attachment without charge. For the first time, a competitive mode was directly available through Battlelog menus, following the Getaway expansion about 9 months after release. This was separate from the normal ranked and unranked servers, placing players in special 5v5 game modes intended to be highly competitive. Matchmaking was determined by a player's skill rating, making it the first game in the series to publicly use such a skill-based matchmaking system. Maps and modes were rotated based on themed seasons every few weeks. Top-ranked players were displayed on leaderboards, but ultimately the rewards for participating in the mode were limited to a unique competitive rank and a few bonus achievements. Partially owing to these limited rewards, the popularity of the competitive mode was low. Other factors contributed more. With the game having a divisive reputation and below expected sales, it split the player base hard between the normal server playlists and a new ranked system. Resistance to skill-based matchmaking being what it is, even at that time, likely mattered far less than the fact that the modes were so unlike the typical Battlefield experience, even more so than the base Battlefield Hardline game, that interest simply wasn't there. As a result, the competitive mode was closed by the developers in just under a year, at least for consoles. On PC, the mode is present and available for queue, but this requires 10 players total searching for the match to launch, which no longer occurs. What is interesting is that the mode's implementation offers at least some insight to how players might respond to future uses of skill-based matchmaking in a competitive setting. By far, one of Hardline's most notable features was that of the Gunbench, added about 1 year after launch with the Betrayal expansion. However, it was probably also one of the most unknown and underutilized owing to its late addition and almost hidden nature on Battlelog under the Player Agent menu, and then a further tab over on the Loadout tab, at least on PC clients. Clicking the button would launch the game's Gunbench tool, an interactive in-game environment where players could test-fire weapons in a shooting range. Though interactive target systems to track aim were present, real-time bullet damage was missing and would have been great to have. Notably, players could significantly customize weapon aesthetics here more than any other Battlefield game. It allowed the customization of up to 5 primary weapons with custom target reticles, colors, camouflages, even visual wear and tear. Even player agent cosmetics could be altered, offering incredible player personalization. Hardline contained a single-player campaign which was a truly unique experience. Spanning 10 levels and a prologue, it could take somewhere around 6 to 8 hours to complete depending on how quickly you wanted to progress. The story follows a Miami police detective who, while initially starts with handling routine drug busts, gets caught up in a sinister corruption plot. The missions are episodic in nature, each feeling substantially different and independent, taking place sometimes weeks, months, or years apart. This gives it the feeling of a big-budget TV show, and the significant amounts of dialogue and exposition bolster that impression, especially during periods of downtime. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. The added time given to explore the characters' backstories, feelings, and motivations allows for a far greater connection with them. Even minor and supporting characters have an excellent level of character development. On that note, the quality of the writing for the story is excellent. Yes, it's occasionally cliché, but it is well-paced, natural, and the humor mostly lands well.
Wait, where's the kid? No idea. Looks like he split.
I want my laptop.
I thought I told you to wait in the trunk.
The voice acting talent brought in helps it go the extra mile, with great performances from well-established actors whose game models reflect themselves. The pacing of each mission depends on the story, with some, especially the early ones, being far slower and more dialogue-heavy. They are sometimes broken down into multiple acts, taking players to new locations and even a few quasi-open-world sets for players to make decisions of their own. These make some missions feel exceptionally lengthy, but the game has a lot of extra things for the player to do. Case files can be solved by collecting evidence. Each will allow players to access more background of the story narrated by the main characters. Arrest warrants for certain enemies will provide bonus achievements and unlocks if brought in with a takedown. This helps give players a major choice in their gameplay style, since while the going in guns blazing option is always available, a slower, more stealthy alternative is certainly present. Abilities like showing your badge and tossing a bullet casing to distract enemies really helps here. Additionally, the set designs, visuals, and environments are extraordinary, taking players to gorgeous tropical locales, dense urban neighborhoods and cities, and several others. These allow the campaign to routinely offer a fresh experience and new scenery, and also permits the characters to chew away at the surroundings.
What kind of an asshole lives in a place like this?
A rich asshole.
Without the backdrop of international war, you can very well forget the title of the game you are playing. Once you do remember, there's a tendency to ask, where's the battlefield? In a couple of missions, this is answered with, oh, there it is. Even in the longer missions, certain acts bring out the Battlefield-style in-your-face action players might be looking for, if only for short bursts. Major destruction is also heavily present and on full display, sometimes scripted and other times readily apparent and useful to the player for small engagements. Even with all of its dominating drama, there are several action-heavy sequences and many great cinematic and memorable moments to be had. All in all, Battlefield Hardline provided a strong campaign for what the game was. It just perhaps wasn't what the core Battlefield audience was looking for.
Okay, that was awesome.
On its surface, the multiplayer gameplay of Hardline initially feels different from previous titles. On paper, you might get that impression too, given the vast amount of changes in tone, theme, factions, style, and modes. This certainly affected how the game was perceived at launch by players. However, the more familiar one becomes with the gameplay and mechanics of Hardline, it is inevitable that the Battlefield feel becomes readily apparent. This isn't due to the presence of Conquest either, the staple Battlefield game mode. Despite the vast differences in the several new modes, it is the retention of classic mechanics, flow, and ultimately the sandbox dynamics of infantry and plentiful vehicles, and the fantastic interaction between it all that make it undeniably Battlefield. The in-game deployment menu was remarkably similar to Battlefield 4, with the ability to scroll to zoom in and out, have a picture-in-picture of the teammate selected, and see all available vehicles tailored for each specific map on the points they are available. Tabs at the top allow players to change their kit loadouts and customize vehicles. The Boosts tab is where player-owned boosts are enabled, which provide bonuses for specific actions or playstyles, making it easier to rank up or obtain items. These features were already a great foundation, but more small changes are present. On the vehicle deployment buttons, when a vehicle dies in combat, a meter slowly refills on the respective icon, indicating how long it will be until it becomes available. This keeps players informed of whether a vehicle will be ready soon, and helps them decide whether it's worth it to wait a few seconds on the menu or jump back into combat sooner. Additionally, before a round begins, icons show how many players are attempting to fill seats in the selected vehicle. While this doesn't guarantee the driver's seat if picked first, it at least shows if you will have a full party bus when the round begins. In short, building off of the Battlefield 4 menu, this may be one of the best deployment screens in the series. One final point to add is about the squad spawn system of Hardline. Unlike every other game in the series, Hardline has no player in combat spawn restriction. You can spawn on a teammate at any point in time, regardless of whether they are being obliterated by enemies at point-blank range. As long as they are alive, you can spawn. This is a double-edged sword for gameplay. On one hand, it allows players the freedom to spawn wherever they want. Perhaps in a critical situation they can spawn in and turn the tide, or they just might be insta-killed. But on the flip side, having an epic battle with an enemy only to have one of their squad mates spawn in at the last second and eliminate you is very frustrating. As just mentioned, the franchise staple Conquest mode makes a return in Hardline, focusing on the capture of flag objectives. The only difference is that it isn't the dominant game type, let alone the most popular. Given the reduced scope of the game not involving international conflict, major new modes which more accurately fit the theme were created, along with an assortment of unique, smaller, and more competitive-based modes. The first of these is Heist, a full-scale mode in which the criminal team must succeed in stealing loot, such as money or diamonds, while the law enforcement side must defend the objectives and prevent them from being extracted. The criminal team begins by breaking in to secure objectives, such as a vault, giving it a rush mode-like feel. This takes a bit of time and can be prevented by the police. A successful break-in allows a single criminal player to pick up the objective and proceed to take it to an extraction site. Successful extraction of all loot earns a criminal victory, while the elimination of all criminal team tickets earns a law enforcement win. Heist was one of Hardline's most popular game modes, owing to a frequent struggle between even teams and a strong layer of tactical team play needed for victory. It was also a mode that benefited from a strong game knowledge. Not knowing the map layouts or game mechanics could leave some players lost on where to go to get to objectives, or pathing between to intercept criminals with loot. Players more interested in shooting enemies and less inclined to play the objectives sometimes left rounds of Heist one-sided and over extremely quickly. The second major new mode was Hotwire. Hotwire is a fast-paced twist on Conquest, setting 5 objectives on the map as neutral, drivable vehicles themselves. Players on both teams rush from their deployments to capture these vehicles, usually a mix of sports cars, sedans, vans, motorbikes, and sometimes a large gas tanker. Once inside, achieving high speeds and maintaining it reduced enemy tickets. The marked objective vehicles, being unarmored and without player upgrades or countermeasures, are extremely vulnerable to enemy fire, especially explosives. This made them very easy to destroy, instantly respawning a fresh vehicle of the same type in its original map spawn location. This also allowed objectives to change hands frequently, resulting in back-and-forth games. Utilizing the incredible vehicle and map design of Hardline, along with the full suite of vehicles on most maps, Hotwire is a mode which has almost come to define the game. The lack of personal rocket launchers, being obtained exclusively from sparse battle pickups or more frequently from the player equipment upgrades on their cars, meant that getting one shot by them was more uncommon than memes of the time would have you believe. More frequently, additive bullet damage or carefully placed tripwire mines and breaching charges would be the destructive factor. It was also the game mode that allowed the mechanic class to shine, placing sabotage explosives on unoccupied vehicles, getting crazy hits with their launchers, and using the repair tool to maximum effect. The sandbox dynamic of Hotwire cannot be overstated. Even for players who just wanted to shoot enemies, they were still active participants of objective play since the enemy-marked cars frequently came to you. Avoiding all enemy damage required strong map awareness, maximum speed play, launching cars off of ramps and hills, or even into multitudes of players for road kills. Sniping drivers was rewarding, camping streets imperative, and if chasing a car on foot was no use, getting into a car yourself with a buddy and hunting one down in a high-speed chase was immersive, chaotic, and extremely fun. On some maps, you could go the extra mile with a scout helicopter and unload your grenade launcher for an epic hit. Many gamers may have rolled their eyes over the logic of cops stealing vehicles to prevent their capture, but the gameplay speaks for itself, providing some of the greatest sandbox moments in a Battlefield game ever. Another of the game's popular mainstays, and in contrast to the high-speed pursuits of Hotwire, the Blood Money game mode concentrated battles over large stacks of green. Blood Money pitted teams against each other in attempts to take money out of a central money pile and return it to their respective vaults. Each player could carry up to 10 stacks of cash at a time, accumulated one by interacting with the money stack. Victory could be achieved by claiming the required amount, or by having the most money when the timer runs out. In this way, Blood Money was a sort of spin on Capture the Flag, only with a permanent, ongoing struggle. As multiple players were often busy looting cash from the central pile, these were often locations of huge, chaotic battles and grenade spam as teams sought to dominate the area. Adding to this round-robin of steal and return, players could also obtain stacks of cash by looting the enemy vault found on their side of the map. This created chaotic moments of getting caught stealing when enemies returned to drop off their funds. Additionally, getting killed while carrying a stack of cash left that pile on the spot, allowing enemies to pick up that amount and run off. These multiple options of obtaining cash created a dynamic where multiple playstyles were encouraged. From fighting the main battle over the central money pile, sneaking toward or speeding through the enemy base to steal money or eliminate cash-straddled foes, defending your own vault by defeating intruders, or booby-trapping any and all vaults with explosives, there was something for everyone. Several smaller modes accompanied these primary game types. The classic Team Deathmatch was present and worked extremely well with the smaller map layouts. Later on, with the launch of the Criminal Activity DLC, a variant of TDM would come in the form of Bounty Hunter mode. Upon killing an enemy, a large coin would hover over the spot, allowing the player or a teammate to collect it before it disappeared. Collecting it was required to add to the team's score, while grabbing a teammate's bounty coin denied the possibility of an enemy score. The classic Capture the Flag mode, known here as Capture the Bag, functioned the same way, with a few tweaks from the Battlefield 3 and 4 versions. However, the heavy use of fast unarmed vehicles greatly worked to the advantage of this implementation. Competitive modes were also present in the form of Rescue and Crosshair, both 10 players max with 5 per team. Both modes are short, multi-round matches with 1 life per round. Rescue finds the law enforcement team aiming to, rescue 2 hostages being held by the criminal side. Victory could also be achieved by eliminating the enemy team. Crosshair is a similar concept, with the law enforcement side trying to safely escort a player-controlled VIP, armed only with a deagle and extra armor, to an extraction point before he is eliminated by the criminal faction. Both of these modes worked effectively enough, especially in the competitive league format for which they were intended. However, like the 5v5 Heist mode, it can be argued that these small-scale game modes were underplayed and undervalued by the community. This isn't too surprising given the tendency of the Battlefield player to want to play the typical large-scale Battlefield conflict. Even so, they had their fans at the time. More importantly, with Hardline's player count waning over the months and years, these modes provided a quick, effective, and fun way to sustain and boost ailing server populations. Despite retaining a 4-class system from the previous 2 Battlefield titles, Hardline made some changes to the formula. Assault, Engineer, Support, and Recon would be known here as Operator, Mechanic, Enforcer, and Professional, respectively. These names don't roll off the tongue and are sometimes difficult for the casual player to remember. While they definitely nail the theme and intent, the one negative might be that it was often difficult to distinguish them apart based on player model class silhouettes. In principle, these classes function similarly to their counterparts. However, default class gadgets are not a permanently equipped feature, though they are retained by their respective classes. Revive shock paddles for the operator or repair torch for the mechanic. These must be selected independently and can be replaced with other gadgets at will. In this game, the revive paddles will not work on a teammate who was roadkilled or headshot. The mechanic class does not possess high explosive rocket launcher options, instead being limited to the grenade launcher. Rocket launchers themselves could be found as battle pickups around the map environment or as trunk upgrades for vehicles, and any class could utilize them. The mechanic was also the only class able to equip the satellite phone gadget, this game's version of the team spawn radio beacons traditionally set aside for the recon class. Even though the class names and silhouettes were sometimes too abstract, each retained significant class distinction thanks to its unique weapon restrictions and associated roles. Operator still functioned as a frontline medic, Mechanic as anti-vehicle with its strong grenade launchers and explosives, Enforcer with its powerful battle rifles and ammo support, and Professional with its sniper rifle access along with tripwires, booby traps, and SMG sidearms. All other secondary gadgets helped only to solidify these identities. Battlefield 4 introduced the field upgrade system to the series, allowing each class a specialization bonus based on squad performance. Battlefield Hardline replaced this feature with a reputation system which worked much the same way. 4 potential upgrades were available per round based on the player's chosen upgrade path. Players earned reputation by completing team actions. Upon reaching a certain level of threshold in the reputation system, players are rewarded the option of choosing from one of 2 perks. If a player is killed before reaching the next threshold, it will subsequently be reset on the next respawn. This made it more difficult to obtain a max reputation, with servers even including a notification for players who hit that threshold. Once a round has ended, the player's reputation is reset and does not carry over to the next game. Reputation boosts were available through battle packs, which could boost the progression values between each perk. The ranking system has been commonplace in Battlefield since Battlefield 2. In Battlefield 3 and 4, an option in Battlelog allowed players to reset their stats and progress, though this didn't offer any greater reward other than a personal challenge. For owners of the Robbery expansion, Hardline took the extra step by introducing the Legendary system. Though the game had a maximum rank of 150, once that final rung was reached, players could activate Legendary status. Doing so then resets the player's rank to 0, wipes all cash they've accrued, removes all purchased weapons, gadgets, attachments, vehicle upgrades, and progression for all just stated. There are exceptions to this, such as emblems, patches, camos, battle packs, and weapons unlocked through special assignments. However, the 4 Syndicate assignments, 1 for each class, are also reset, removing the 4 rewarded weapons and 4 associated pistols. While this resets nearly all progression back to square one, players could then rank up to 150 again. At max rank, this process could then be repeated an additional 14 times, progressing to the next level of Legendary status. In total, this technically raises the rank cap in Hardline to 2400, making it similar to the Call of Duty franchise's prestige levels. Each time a player activates Legendary status, they earn 5% bonus cash for all gameplay actions, which is stackable. For example, a standard kill in Hardline earns $100. At Legendary status 5, the player would earn $125 per kill. This allowed a legendary player to quickly repurchase weapons and upgrades. However, the amount shown on the player HUD doesn't reflect this bonus, creating some confusion. Additional benefits to legendary status include unique colors, icons, and epic status displayed on player kill cards, as well as having all bonus headgear unlocked for player use. This kept major rewards mostly cosmetic for balance purposes. Hardline was the first game in the series to have different categories of melee weapons, each having different swing speeds, damages, and takedown zones. Heavier options like shovels, sledgehammers, and fire axes had the longest windup but were guaranteed kills in a single hit, while knives had a tremendously fast swing at close range for a high value of 75 damage. If a player was using a blunt melee weapon that was non-lethal, such as a baton, performing a takedown on an enemy left them on the ground with a prompt to interrogate them. Completing this action would temporarily spot all enemies on the minimap for the team. Small ammo lockers and wall-mounted medkits are staples of nearly every map, found in various tactical positions, allowing players to reload a few magazines or quickly restore health in a pinch. Easily located via minimap icons, their presence blends in seamlessly with the environments, making for realistic implementation. The inclusion of such neutral resource stations would be the first since Battlefield Vietnam 11 years earlier. Like many previous titles, a numerous selection of gadgets were available to players, many exclusive to one of the 4 classes. Grappling hooks and ziplines mark their first appearance since Battlefield II Special Forces. Radically updated mechanics thanks to the Frostbite engine makes them more reliable and easy to use, but they remain fundamentally balanced within the context of the game's level design, unlike problems found in Battlefield 2042. In Hardline, the grappling hook and zipline are equipable gadgets for any class, although both can be found as battle pickups on some maps. The grappling hook has a swift animation, but climbing the rope is slow, making players vulnerable. Limited uses of 4 without a reload help balance its effectiveness, as does its status as a gadget, forcing players to choose between it or other options. Both gadgets cannot target out-of-bounds spaces or rooftops, preventing a vast amount of map exploits. Gas grenades also make their first appearance since Battlefield II Special Forces. In this iteration, being hit by the gas cloud noticeably results in a blurring effect akin to hefty suppression, lasting several seconds even after leaving the area. A secondary effect of the gas is a slow but accumulating damage to the player, eventually resulting in death if they remain in the cloud. A third, less commonly known effect of the gas is that enemies hit by it take double damage, significantly increasing player lethality and sometimes causing confusion or accusations. This makes the gas grenades, also found as an upgrade for the mobile attack trucks, incredibly useful, effective, and slightly annoying. However, each class has access to a gas mask, which takes up a gadget slot. The mask completely negates all damage and makes the wearer immune to its effects. Unlike Battlefield 1, these masks cannot be taken off, though the visual effects are better and does not prohibit aiming down the sights. While Battlefield 4 was the first game in the series to feature incendiary grenades, Hardline was the first to make them effective in a big way. The blast radius was large, and the damage was massive. In just a few short seconds, you could be melted if not paying attention. Most notably, these grenades had a visual effect unique to Hardline. Friendly incendiary grenades burned a bright blue color, clearly denoting their team origin and effectively communicating to the player that they could traverse the impact area without taking damage. In total, 28 gadgets would make their way to Battlefield Hardline, most of which would follow the traditional mechanics of the same items found in previous titles. Others, such as the Tactical Toolkit and Survivalist Pens, would be new and unique, but there are examples where changes were made. A fire mask prevented any damage from fire effects, acting as a direct counter. Laser tripwire mines replaced claymores and remain incredibly effective against infantry and vehicles, though they can be interacted with by enemies to defuse if noticed in time. The satellite phone, equivalent to the radio beacon of Battlefield 3 and 4, this time is in possession of the mechanic class instead of the typical recon class. Throwing knives make their first appearance in the series. A deployable camera provides an effect similar to the classic tug systems, revealing nearby enemy players on the minimap. However, it can be stuck to walls and ceilings and is much more difficult to see. The M79 and M320 grenade launcher is exclusive to the mechanic class. These explosives are the only major anti-vehicle weapons available to player loadouts. In Hardline, all shoulder-launched rockets are placed as either battle pickups or vehicle upgrade equipment. All battle pickups ranged from LMGs, ziplines and grappling hooks, defibrillators, harpoon launchers, nail guns, or these anti-vehicle rockets. Players could obtain an RPG or Stinger rocket from the trunk of any car they encountered, so long as the previous occupant had them equipped. The only difference is that the battle pickup versions had 2 shots, while the vehicular version only had 1. As major class items like the ammo crate, medbag, and defibs are not mandatory equipment in Hardline, the game's ammo and health stations are an excellent stand-in for everything except the repair tool, while the defibrillator gadget is also found around maps as a battle pickup. These are usually found along walls and can be equipped as the main item until swapped off. This also makes Hardline the only game in the series to have a non-lethal battle pickup. Almost naturally, a riot shield was available as a gadget exclusively for the Enforcer class. Like many comparable games, players could equip it to block incoming small arms fire from the front. Bashing enemies required a respectable 2 hits to kill. These are mechanics acceptable for most players. However, unlike all other Battlefield titles, when not the active gadget, the humorously large shield was placed on the back of the player, and in this position continued to block all small arms damage, including armor-piercing ammo. This provided exceptional safety for players and made the gadget one of the most meta, overpowered items in the game, making it almost required to remain competitive. As Hardline was built on the same bones as Battlefield 4, the Commander feature made an appearance as well, just in a different format. In Hardline, this position was known as the team's hacker, although the designation was almost humorously confusing when you had to tell your friends that the enemy team had a hacker, but not the cheating kind. This role worked very similar to the Battlefield 4 version, allowing a single player to support their team through a variety of actions through a top-down camera of the Battlefield map. They could view the team's squad list, team positions, and a menu of abilities that can be performed. One cool distinction with Battlefield 4 was that relinquishing the role placed you back on the team as a field agent rather than forcing you to leave and rejoin the server. This was more akin to the way commanders worked in Battlefield 2 and 2142. Following the game's theme, the hacker abilities were significantly scaled down in scope and largely unable to eliminate enemy players through direct intervention like artillery. This certainly removed some of the satisfaction from the role. Abilities instead ranged from GPS jamming and spotting, assigning high-value targets, reducing cooldown on abilities, marking points of interest, instant squad reputation upgrades, and fast deployment. A hacker's primary role was the capture and denial of assets placed on all of the maps. These were things like security cameras, gas canisters, and electrical stations. While the hacker position was a cool concept and functioned in almost the same capacity as the Battlefield 4 commander, the limited scope and lack of direct involvement clearing enemies made it a somewhat repetitive, unengaging feature. Hardline would eventually provide players with 51 weapons with which to do battle, obtainable via assignment completion or purchase with cash. Many of these would be available to both factions, but there would also be several specific to the law enforcement or criminal side. This would make it the first Battlefield game since Battlefield 3 to provide such exclusivity. Players could obtain a weapon license, allowing them to use each weapon while on either faction. This required obtaining 1,250 kills with each individual weapon, and they were still tied to their respective class. A vast array of attachments are present for most weapons. Following the model of Battlefield 4, these allowed customizations of sights and scopes, muzzles, grips, and accessories. The major new addition falls under the lattermost category, AP tracer rounds. This ammunition type affected assault rifles, carbines, battle rifles, and DMRs, allowing them to deal more damage to armored vehicles, though with the downside of a very noticeable tracer fire revealing the player position. Their more notable and practical use was to provide bonus damage to the mechanic's armored insert gadget, effectively nullifying it. Although a direct counter to the armored insert, no additional damage is dealt to players without it. Interestingly, AP tracer rounds frequently resulted in a visual desync, making rounds appear from around the barrel instead of from it. The game's thermal optics are also unique. Hardline thermal optics easily reveal enemy players through smoke, whether environmental, gadget, or grenade-based. Deemed heavily overpowered in those other titles and adjusted accordingly, especially in Battlefield 4, these optics allow players to hide in dense, long-lasting smoke clouds and fire at enemies oblivious to their position. While not completely game-breaking, this unchecked advantage is one of the game's more annoying design choices, especially given the optics' unhindered effectiveness in the brightest settings. In addition to the vast array of small arms, Hardline features a few unique assets not present in other games. These include the nail gun, gas grenade launchers, dual machine pistols, an improvised gun, and explosive bolt launcher. Most notorious of all would be the T-62 CEW taser. Firing one shot at a time at low velocity, a direct hit with the taser results in a short shock effect before placing the hit enemy in a downed state. Here, they can either be interrogated, or, if left alone, effectively die off for a player kill. Although in the game's beta, this weapon would only immobilize an enemy for 5 seconds and require a follow-up takedown, it was later changed to its one-shot kill mechanic, creating a divisive and often frustrating weapon whose balance state remains questionable. The gunplay of Battlefield Hardline worked much the same as most previous Battlefield games. Weapons had a base accuracy stat, their spread increased the longer one fired, the spread decreased at a linear rate once one stopped firing, and weapons were more accurate when standing still compared to when moving. When looking at the mechanics in detail though, it's fair to say that the gunplay mechanics are more similar to Battlefield 3 in their balancing than Battlefield 4. Spread reset times are generally the same across weapons of the same category like Battlefield 3, rather than balanced by rate of fire like Battlefield 4. Similar can be said of spread increase per shot, where it is more arbitrarily decided weapon to weapon rather than balanced on rate of fire again. Base spread is also arbitrarily assigned rather than being the same for most weapons within a weapon category. Hardline also typically had lower minimum damages than both Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4, with most SMGs coming in at about 10 to 12 damage. Like Battlefield 4, however, many of the weapons would use either a 5 BTK or 4 BTK model rather than the 4 BTK or 3 BTK model of Battlefield 3. Even so, the time to kill of Battlefield Hardline could be lightning fast, especially with the Enforcer class's battle rifles, which regularly held the max damage of 33 before even scoring headshots. What all of this led to is a very fast time to kill up close, with an even faster perceived time to death, and a longer time to kill at range, with weapons that had faster rates of fire dominating player selection due to the spread balancing. This made the weapon balancing situation feel closer to Battlefield 3 than BF4 overall, at least when looking at the data. Also interestingly, at one point during Hardline's lifecycle, weapon balancing was separated for the PC and console versions, the first major instance of this happening. Suppression was also in Battlefield Hardline, similar to Battlefield 3 and 4. When a player was suppressed, weapon accuracy and recoil were affected. The strength of the accuracy penalty and the blurring of the screen felt more akin to that of Battlefield 3 than BF4 as well. However, Battlefield 4's suppression was overhauled during its lifecycle. The movement of Battlefield Hardline was pretty standard for a Battlefield game at the time. Players accustomed to Battlefield 3 and 4 would have felt at home with the mechanics. Movement speeds were largely the same from the previous two games. There was still air strafing, and you carried momentum through it even while turning, more similar to Battlefield 3 than 4. Successive jumping would eventually slow the player's movement speed. Contextual leaning was carried forward from Battlefield 4 as well. Some of the expletive movement mechanics from Battlefield 4 carried over into Hardline, however they were not as common, partially due to smoothed-out third-person player animations. What all of this allowed is for experienced players to use the movement systems of the game to have an advantage over those who didn't. A skill gap, if you will. Players could use the movement to engage a fight, adapt mid-fight, or to disengage. The one thing Hardline did differently from every other title in this category, though, is to provide a minor speed boost when holding a knife or secondary weapon. This wasn't anything crazy, but it was a positive feature and unique to the game. In contrast, one of Hardline's major negatives was its body blocking problem. Player models were thick and collided with each other easily. Particularly egregious on smaller maps or constricted game modes, this readily apparent issue was arguably even more frustrating than how bad it was in Battlefield 3. While the movement wouldn't be considered realistic or carried forward to the next Battlefield games, it was on par with what the franchise had been doing for the previous two titles. In typical Battlefield fashion, Hardline features a vast array of vehicles which players could use. These enabled the full sandbox environment and allowed many game modes to provide top-tier dynamic gameplay. Differentiating it from the rest of the series, military vehicles like planes, tanks, or attack helicopters were not included in the game's multiplayer, owing to its small-scale theme. Instead, the game focused on a vast array of civilian transport vehicles, often broken down into different models, like sedans or coupes. Styles and cosmetics varied by faction, with the law enforcement side possessing official police vehicles instead of unmarked sports cars. Further unarmored vehicle options included bikes, trucks, and speedboats, but more exotic options did exist, usually tied to certain maps, such as a limo, a hearse, or the famous drivable couch known as the American Dream. A large gas tanker could also be found on many of the maps. This slow, lumbering vehicle could be moved to strategic positions and destroyed for a massive AoE explosion, making for great fun and wild, unexpected moments. Heavier, more armored vehicles were also included in the game, consisting of armored SUVs, counter-attack trucks, and mobile command trucks, the latter effectively acting as a mobile team spawn point. These ground vehicles had a distinct feeling compared to other games in the series. They accelerated and maneuvered remarkably, but felt heavy, almost magnetized to the ground. This actually allowed for great handling, but still provided the ability to leap over ramps and cliffs. The game's physics also made another distinction. Vehicles clashed, collided, and impacted extremely well, bouncing or grinding together rather than glitching out or meshing together. This helped provide a fun and believable experience with the constant high-speed action. Helicopters could be found in three forms: a large side-armed transport helicopter, a small unarmed scout helicopter, and finally a small attack helicopter. The attack helicopter is simply an armed version of the scout, equating to a classic Little Bird-style chopper from Battlefield 4. However, it has a strong secondary gunner seat, making it extremely effective in the right hands. All helicopters were also vulnerable to small arms fire, taking extra damage from the AP ammo type. This helped provide an extra layer of defense against strong chopper crews. Hardline's vehicles came with other cool features. All vehicles played music through a radio, a third instance in the series after Battlefield Vietnam and Bad Company 2 Vietnam. Though it could be disabled, it played a handful of licensed music which added to the urban immersion. Law enforcement vehicles could blare a few sets of sirens cycled through what would normally be the horn button. Glass windows had a unique chip-based approach to damage, shattering sections before breaking completely. Finally, one of the most famous of the game's features was the ability to lean out of vehicle windows. This made players more vulnerable, but provided far better firing angles by which to eliminate enemy cars you were chasing, or if you were lucky, take down an enemy helicopter in pursuit of your vehicle. Of the 29 unique vehicles which would make their way to Hardline, most of them possessed loadout upgrades in the form of countermeasures, different weapons, and gunner benefits, purchased via cash or vouchers. While these loadout options provided a great deal of player freedom and reward options, the upgrades on some vehicles bordered on overpowered, especially once fully unlocked. This was particularly noticeable with the armored SUVs, which had windows bulletproof to all small arms, had a protected side and rear gun position, minimal bullet drop and spread, and could withstand multiple grenade launcher hits without being destroyed. Even if heavily damaged, the driver's seat could use the fire extinguisher countermeasure, clearing the disabled state and instantly returning it to 37 HP, often allowing it to flee the scene. Regardless of the occasional balance quirk found in the upgrade system, the vehicles of Battlefield Hardline were among the best implemented in the entire series. The weight, handling, physics, models, detailing, and audio design of the vehicles were damn near flawless. Even the helicopters felt heavier, more realistic, and yet responsive. The feel of the motor vehicles in a game focused around cops and criminals needed to shine for the sake of the gameplay and game modes, and it nailed it. Battlefield Hardline may be a controversial game, but the quality of its multiplayer map design is nothing short of spectacular. The visual fidelity and upgrades to the Frostbite engine naturally bring a distinguished crispness and beauty, arguably sometimes exceeding that of any title which came before. The environments are well themed, possess great lighting, and are brought to life with an exceptional level of detail and immersion. But there is so much more that makes them special. The overall level design is remarkable, avoiding many of the pitfalls found across the Battlefield series. These include far better main base designs, multitudes of pathing options between and around objectives, a plethora of cover options, and limited instances of expansive sightlines. One major advantage of Hardline's small-scale theme is the ability to center multiplayer maps within locations otherwise not suitable or believable for all-out war. A bank, a cemetery, a museum, an illegal grow house, a Hollywood mansion, a shopping mall, the list goes on. Many of these levels provide excellent fast-paced combat in localized infantry settings. Within the construct of certain game modes, the layouts themselves offer a particular feel akin to the style of Battlefield 3's close-quarter maps, just with some better spacing applied. Nearly every map is designed from the start to accommodate multiple major game modes like Heist and Blood Money, with a connecting road network perfect for Hotwire. This reduces the plight of maps having issues of gameplay flow or not feeling connected to the game mode. As the level scale increases, more of the game's vehicles are added to facilitate cross-map movement. However, another major advantage that Hardline possesses is the lack of military vehicles like tanks, jets, or attack helicopters, vehicles which, in nearly every other instance, allow for ever-increasing possibilities of game imbalance. The lack of such major assets contributed to the game's class and weapon design no longer needing significant anti-armor rockets or long-range targeting systems, further reducing cross-map lock-ons and frustrating mechanics. The absence of these standard Battlefield features significantly reduces team stomping and base camping. Destruction is featured prominently in Hardline levels. Some houses and apartment buildings are able to be brought down, but most remain permanent fixtures so as not to rid whole areas of cover. Significant amounts of objects and clutter litter the environment, most of which can be blown to pieces with gunfire or explosives. Walls of structures are particularly vulnerable, and certain levels highlight this through the obliteration of properties, such as the mansion on Hollywood Heights. Gunfire alone can chip away at walls or columns, and explosives may open up alternative pathing options, leaving enemies caught off guard. Finally, taking a note from the popularity of its predecessor, Hardline adopted the controversial feature of Levolution. Only this time, the amount of destruction was significantly scaled back to be more impactful and relevant to the map theme. Most importantly, in almost every circumstance, the Levolution provides a net benefit to the map environment, destroying walls to create entryways, bridges to cross ravines, ramps to launch cars, or multiple new pathing options rather than existing as spectacle for spectacle's sake. Even so, in at least one major event on the map downtown, the destruction is scaled up to 11, and yet it still doesn't hamper the gameplay. In this case, the crane coming down blocks one intersection to ground vehicles, but it opens up 3 new pathing options to the central skyscraper lobby. From environment detail, to map interactables, to gameplay flow and pathing, to finally a keen awareness of classic pitfalls, all of these mentioned factors amount to phenomenal level design, exemplified in several original concepts, and even the fantastic reimagining of the Battlefield 3 icon Grand Bazaar, now known here as Chinatown. Battlefield Hardline's divisive interest and poorly timed launch didn't do its sales any favors, especially with a theme drastically different from the main franchise. That being said, the premium model and the legal promise of multiple expansions ended up solidifying longer support than what might have otherwise been required. As a result of the extra time and resources, the post-launch content that Hardline received was of substantial substance and quality. These themed add-ons would begin to launch 4 months after release, opening with the Criminal Activity Pack. This would be followed by the Robbery, Getaway, and Betrayal packs throughout the year, along with the free Blackout pack in November 2015. In total, the 5 expansions would add around 45 weapons, 18 multiplayer maps, multiple vehicles, gadgets and attachments, dozens of new assignments and rewards, and numerous cosmetics. These additions to the game, along with multiple balance patches and countless bug fixes, helped iron out the sometimes jittery and arguably lackluster launch date, and helped turn Hardline into a masterclass of game design, if only for the die-hard fans who stuck around to enjoy it. The game's audio also deserves some recognition. From the effects of the campaign cutscenes and cinematic moments to the multiplayer gameplay, the sound design of Hardline was extremely solid. Gunfire felt hefty, agent actions and dialogue were catchy and unique, and even the game mode narrative updates were constant and informative. Vehicles had an audio design appropriate for each respective model. Luxury cars had a more dampened engine sound or external impacts, while sports cars roared. Tires screeched at sharp turns, and even the shifting of gears was noticeable. Even the beeping of the seatbelts provided added believability. Radios in cars and found around the map environments play a variety of licensed music as well as some others composed exclusively for the game, further adding to its immersion. Hardline's soundtrack was a tour de force, powering through the background of the campaign missions and multiplayer levels. It dominantly captures the atmosphere of the urban settings and southern environments, ranging in form from classic rock to Mississippi blues to drum-heavy grand orchestral. Even the end-of-round screen has a swift intensity which provides a sense of accomplishment and hype for the next round. This score has been used for the entirety of this video, demonstrating its energy and effectiveness. Unfortunately, given that Hardline wasn't as popular as the rest of the Battlefield series, the game's soundtrack remains largely unknown and criminally underrated. Both by reputation and data, the player population of Hardline was not strong nor sustainable, and numbers declined sharply after launch and the years that followed. In recent years, the PC player count amounted to just a few hundred per day and down into the double digits. It was such that for years, the community considered the game essentially dead. If it was not for a few lone gaming communities propping up a server or two at a time, this would be the case. It is nevertheless a huge disappointment considering the vast improvements made to a unique game with some of the highest quality features and mechanics of the entire series up to that point. At present, while a few servers can be found cycling the same few maps repeatedly on console systems, the PC player base has come down to a single server and community, which during peak hours gamers can still find an enjoyable experience. Despite the reality of a rapid increase in quality, Hardline's population crash early on helped define its poor reputation. The game's unconventional theme did not help among typical Battlefield players, but other significant factors were at play which essentially doomed it from the start. First among these was its launch date of March 17, 2015. This set the release of Battlefield Hardline less than a year and a half after the most recent flagship Battlefield title, Battlefield 4. More critically, Hardline was launched while Battlefield 4 was both still incredibly popular and while it was officially still being supported by DICE and EA. The last major DLC, Final Stand, had only been released 3 months earlier. Hefty patches for Battlefield 4 were still coming in every few months, and large content updates, namely the night operations and legacy operations, were still several months out toward late 2015. Interestingly, the March launch date was actually the delayed release date. Hardline was originally scheduled to release in fall 2014, a date which would have brought it into even greater conflict with Battlefield 4 content and popularity. The concurrent support with a flagship Battlefield title confused a great deal of the community. Was Hardline something minor? A weird offshoot? An experiment? Gamers had limited incentive to try a new, drastically different Battlefield game when the one they really enjoyed was finally in an excellent state. From an outside perspective, the announcement of Hardline was sudden, enthusiasm was low, and there was simply no time to build up hype between one title and the next. At the same time, both the beta for Hardline and its initial launch date was underwhelming. Drastic gameplay differences from the main franchise was a small issue compared to stability and comparisons of content with Battlefield 4. Even for numerous Battlefield players who purchased and tried the game, there was an attitude of, maybe this will be something later on, but for now I'll stick with Battlefield 3 or BF4. Unfortunately, most players didn't return, not only because of the interest in the flagship games, but also due to the launch of Battlefield 1 18 months later. Even if the game had significantly improved, and it certainly did, there was the impression that it was being abandoned anyway. The incredible reception of the Battlefield 1 announcement and its associated hype completely overshadowed any quality improvements or content for Hardline. Finally, there was the use of the Battlefield name. which has arguably been the largest and most enduring point of debate since its reveal. Did the game being called Battlefield Hardline help or hurt it? There are two ways to view this. The first is that without the Battlefield nomen, Hardline, by that or any other name, would have needed to stand on its own, and it would have required greater marketing efforts to promote the new IP. Would this extra cost even pay off for some name unfamiliar to gamers? The argument that being separate from the Battlefield franchise would bolster its popular reception is not a new one. The unique theme drastically differs from its peers. One more degree of separation might actually boost its appeal, while simultaneously not offending the psychological profile of the core Battlefield player. Even so, the similarities of the core game foundations, the engine, movement, UI, game modes, gunplay, and sandbox dynamics intrinsic to the franchise would still be self-evident and inevitably draw comparisons and criticisms. A game not called Battlefield would still be Battlefield at its heart, and that is a problem. The second viewpoint is that with the Battlefield title added, the game is far easier to market, but it sets certain expectations. There is an established brand and name recognition. There is an assumption that it will follow the formula and be supported long-term with content and updates. The added name recognition definitely generated greater interest in Hardline from the get-go and certainly helped promote it. Yes, most of the gameplay was similar, but there is a catch. The theme didn't follow the formula, as cops and criminals definitely broke with precedent. The lack of a military setting dominated the conversation and still does to this day. Regardless of whether a quality product came to fruition, which it did. Regardless of whether it received substantial content, which it did. Regardless of whether it would do many features better than the previous games, which it did. The game's setting was simply too brain-melting and different from what the core players were used to or wanted to give it the fair chance it deserved. In that, we can also add that regardless of whether Hardline was called Battlefield or not, the likely answer to the question is that the name didn't matter at all. Simply put, calling it Battlefield gave it more exposure and definitely helped initial sales, but it needed to find its own audience, and the core Battlefield community was largely disinterested. Divisive as the game may be, Hardline is Battlefield, and it yielded a mighty legacy that many people might not be aware of. Many of its features and innovations would retroactively be applied to Battlefield 4 as it was still receiving significant support during the concurrent period. These include great minimap scaling options, indicators for player elevation on the minimap, the total objective capture radius on the minimap, hit marker customization, and weapon sight reticle customization. Going forward, many of these would be included in future titles in the series. The new ability to take health and ammo from the associated team classes would return in Battlefield V with much acclamation. The concept of having multiple, customizable loadouts per class would follow in almost every Battlefield game. The thing is, Hardline's lack of critical success sometimes makes it difficult to observe or appreciate everything it did right. Things like vehicle weight and controls, UI and customization features, testing ranges, the gunbench, and even kit balancing could all be looked at for inspiration. More than anything else, the map design of Hardline is simply begging to be examined closely, both for the layout quality, but also the great lengths the team went to mitigate frustrating elements. If you were among the many gamers who at the time of Hardline's release avoided it because of either its reputation or an existing love of Battlefield 3 or Battlefield 4, or alternatively, tried it and quickly abandoned it for lacking the feel of the main Battlefield series, I can only emphasize the following. You missed out on something extraordinary. It's true, while Battlefield Hardline was missing the gritty immersion of global conflict and grand setting, the gameplay, design, mechanics, modes, and sandbox experience was true Battlefield to the core. The gunplay was excellent, level design immaculate, vehicles fantastic, and the overall state of fun constant. It is a testament to the crazy anything can happen style of the Battlefield series that the term Battlefield a moment came into being. Yet in Hardline, the combination of these elements, the engine, the physics, and perhaps the more down-to-earth setting, ultimately provided far greater opportunities for these moments to occur. Players could set up or take part in unexpected destruction, witness hilarious antics through the use of gadgets, or experience something insane as a result of the high-speed vehicular chases. Nothing can now change how the game was perceived at launch, nor its sales or player counts. Hardline will forever be that black sheep of the series, but here and now in retrospect, aside from a few minor flaws and balance issues, it is clear that Battlefield Hardline is a treasure to be remembered, a monument of quality and design, and that the team from Visceral Games deserved acclaim for their work and dedication. As gamers, it is completely okay to not be interested in a product for one reason or another, but we should always look back and question if we were wrong. If possible, we should give those titles another chance to see if they improved, or see if the conventional wisdom was wrong. We should endeavor to understand the games of the franchises we love, and play them while we still can. Otherwise, like so many out there, we might regret not getting to experience a game as great as Battlefield Hardline. Nine out of 10.